Hello,
Hi.
hello, Fengshu. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to week 2 of the chess camp. So as you hopefully saw on the slide, today we'll be moving to the our second stage of chess training, which involves tactics. So I'll quickly be covering what are tactics in chess in general, and then we'll move on to our first tactic for this week, which is the pin. And then I'll explain some things about the pin, like what it is. There's two types, so I'll explain those, and then we'll go through some examples, and at the end we'll go through some practice. Okay, so without further ado, I'll quickly present my screen. So firstly, I'll cover what a tactic is in general in chess. So a tactic in general in chess is basically, in a sense, like a set of moves that are kind of forced in a sense, which can result in some form of advantage for us, or some form of gain. So this gain can be something obscure. It can also be something really obvious, such as our opponent losing material, losing pieces, for example. Um, or other advantages could be something a bit more obscure, like we have a very active position, for example, but those are a bit advanced. And for the sake of this, we'll be doing this week some tactics that basically have a really direct advantage that you can see at the end, which pretty much is just being up material, for example. And there are many, many different types of tactics. So for today, we'll be covering the pin, which is the first tactic we're doing. So in chess, basically the pin is a tactic in which we attack a piece, and in a sense, we don't allow that piece to move. So what I mean by that is because if that piece that we're attacking moves, then there is a piece that is of higher value behind that piece, which we'll be able to take. So I'll quickly demonstrate an example just to show what that means, because it might be a bit difficult to understand. So in something like this, so this is an opening we've seen last week on Thursday. So for example, this is a pin. So this bishop here, it's pinning the knight to the queen. So what that means is that this knight, if it moves right now, then obviously we can take the queen. So for example, the knight moves here, for example, then we can simply take the queen. And we basically traded a bishop for a queen, so that's advantageous for us. So that's kind of what I mean when I say this knight can't really move, because if the knight moves, then obviously black would be losing out on their queen. So in chess, there are two types of pins, which are relative pins as well as absolute pins. So a relative pin is something like this, where the piece that is pinned, obviously speaking, the opponent obviously doesn't want to move this knight, but technically speaking in chess, you can still technically move this knight, even though obviously it will lead to the loss of a queen, but this piece can still technically be moved. However, an absolute pin is basically when a piece is pinned to the king. So that piece can't move even if it wanted to. So to demonstrate an example of that, we can have some situation like this. So this, I'll flip the board to make it easier. So this for black is an absolute pin, because even if this knight wanted to move, it can't move, because if it moves, then obviously the bishop would take the king. So you see that this knight can't actually move, even the computer won't allow me. So these are the two types of pins, relative as well as absolute. So just to reemphasize, a relative pin is basically we can move the piece if we want to, but that would lead to the loss of material. Whereas an absolute pin is basically we can't move this piece even if we wanted to, because it is pinned to the king, and the piece that is doing the pinning will be able to basically take the king if the piece moves. So I'll show a few examples, and then I'll have you guys figure out if those are absolute pins or relative pins. So we'll go, if I can get this to work, I'll stop sharing for a moment. Okay. Okay, I'll set up a few positions on this board, and we'll see if you guys are able to figure out if these are relative or absolute. So I'll place two kings here. So let's say we have a position like this. So for white, can anyone tell me if this is a relative pin or an absolute pin?
An absolute pin.
Yep, that is correct. It's indeed an absolute pin. The reason being that this rook here, it's pinning the bishop to the king, and this bishop can't actually move, because then obviously we'd be able to take the king. So this is indeed an example of an absolute pin. We'll show another example. So let's say the king is here, queen here. Say black has a knight here and bishop here. So for white, again, is this an absolute or relative pin?
A relative pin.
Yep, that is correct. And the reason being, this knight can still move if it wants to, but then black would simply lose their queen. So this is an example of a relative pin. Okay, we'll do one more and I'll have you guys explain why it's which type of pin, just to make sure you guys understood fully, and then, yep. So we'll do something a bit more tricky. Say, okay. So for white, is this a relative pin or an absolute pin, as well as why?
It is a relative pin.
Yep. Why is it a relative pin?
Because the pawn blocking the rook
Mm-hmm.
can move to b6, which
Yep.
means the pawn has somewhere to go.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That
So it's not a absolute pin.
right. Yeah, that's correct. So this pawn, it can basically move because this rook obviously isn't the king. So, for example, it can take the knight. It can even push forwards. Um, so this is indeed a relative pin because obviously the pawn can move or even take the knight because, well, black can choose to lose out on the rook if they choose to. So that's good. Okay, so that's in general basically how the pin works. So now we'll look at a couple of um, situations where the pin was basically used in a game to either win the game or basically gain a very nice advantage. So I'll stop sharing for a second and quickly pull that up. Okay. And tactics like these can happen at a lot of different levels. Some of these games are actually at the highest level, even at the Chess World Championship. And some of these are just in normal tournament games. So pretty much under any circumstance, these tactics can happen. So for example, in this first position, this is an example of where a tactic happened at a very high level. So this is actually a world championship match in, I believe, 1927. And then here, basically with the white pieces, so black had just played the move queen to e5, just so you guys know. So queen to e5. So immediately, hopefully you guys notice that there is a pin happening here. Just to reemphasize again, is this a relative or absolute pin?
It is a relative pin.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And reason?
Because the rook can move.
Yep, that is correct. The rook can move if it wants to, but it might lose out on the queen, but that's up to black to decide. So here in this position, after they move queen to e5, there is actually a winning combination here that exploits this pin of the rook to the queen, and white found this and was able to win the game. So here, white starts off with f4, attacking the queen. So the queen, it wants to defend this rook because, for example, let's say the queen goes back to c7 just to demonstrate. Then you'll see that this knight is defending the rook. This is actually another tactic called removing the defender. We'll combine a couple here just to show you. So here the knight's defending the rook, but here we can remove this knight. And then after black takes back, then we can take the rook and we'll be up a rook. So basically after we attack the queen has to stay defending this rook. So black went queen to g7 to defend the rook. And here, like I mentioned, basically white takes off this knight so that this knight is no longer defending this rook. Black takes back, makes sense. And here, this is basically the stunning move of the game. Firstly, you might notice that here in this position, that this pin basically, black actually has no way to get out of this pin. Reason being, if this rook moves, obviously we lose the queen. And there's no way where we can move the rook where the queen is still protected. So for example, if this pawn doesn't exist, let's just pretend. I'll quickly demonstrate. So let's say the position was something like this. So in, oh, sorry about that. This one here so I can demonstrate. So here, although there's still a pin, I altered the position slightly. So, but here there's actually a safe move for black, which is to play rook to c7, because we're moving the pin piece out of the way this time. But you'll notice that the queen, which was behind this pin, is now actually protected by the rook. So that is sort of what black is trying to hope for in order to move the pin piece out of the way and still defend the piece that is behind it. So in this situation, the rook would be able to defend the queen. However, in the game, you'll see that here, there's a lot of things in the way, so that's not actually possible. And here, white would really like to play the move rook to c1. So the idea with rook to c1 is that since this is pinned, we can exploit this pin. So by exploiting this pin, pretty much when you have a pin, you try to attack it again with another piece. So you attack it again with another piece because obviously the pin piece can't move. So obviously you have to use other pieces to defend itself, to defend it. And at a certain point, you'll basically have more pieces than your opponent, hopefully, that can attack this rook in this case, and then you should be able to win it. So however, rook c1 here, you'll see that there's a double attack on this rook, and it's only defended once. You can't defend it again with the king, for example. It's too far away. But here, the only problem with rook to c1 directly is that black can actually take this rook. Reason being, as you can see with the arrow, it's checked to the king. So white doesn't actually have time to take the queen. Instead, they actually have to take the rook. If you don't take the rook, then obviously you lose your queen, and then you end up losing the game. So you can't actually play rook to c1 immediately because it's checked. So here, the player with white, they played the stunning move king to f2. So the idea with king to f2 is to firstly maintain this pin. Secondly, enable rook to c1, basically to attack the pin piece. That's a common theme, like I mentioned, which is when you have a pin piece, you try to attack it again because that piece can't move, so it's vulnerable. So here, white's idea is to simply play rook to c1, put two pieces on this rook, and then be able to win the rook. So to demonstrate, let's say king b7, sorry. After rook c1, you'll see that there is actually no rook takes c1 now, because the king's no longer on g1. So if rook takes c1, then simply queen takes g7, because the rook is no longer checking the king. So that is why king f2 is quite the stunning move. You get out of the way, and then you enable the threat of rook to c1. And that's kind of the beauty of chess. There's like moves that seem really indirect to the main threat. Like for example, king to f2, normally speaking, it doesn't look like it has any relationship to a move like rook to c1 to double attack the rook, because it just seems like you're moving your king. But that's kind of like the beauty of chess. Somewhat random moves, we'll say, actually can also sometimes have really deep meanings or deep threats to it. So after rook to c1 here, the game only went on for like three more moves. But basically, just to show you guys, basically here, black played queen f6. The idea is that here, if you go rook to c1, black wants to try to maybe play something like queen h4 to check the king. And once the king moves, obviously you can move the rook because there's no longer this pin because the queen's out of the way. And here, if you're wondering why g3, blocking the queen and attacking, doesn't work because there's queen takes h2, then you would lose your queen. So that was the idea, to play queen h4 so that this rook is no longer pinned. But here, white simply covered themselves with the move g3 so that this check is no longer possible. Black tries one more move, but here simply rook c1, as I mentioned, attack the pin piece again. This pin, there's no way to get out of it. No checks to give with the queen in order to save the rook. And in fact, this rook is just going to be lost on the next move. So that's an example of a pin, exploiting this pin, this kind of forever pin in a sense, because black could never actually get out of it. So that's the first example. Second example we have here, again, it's another world championship match in 1935 this time. And the player with the white pieces now. This pin is actually a little bit complex, but I'll explain it. So basically, you'll see here right now, so it's white to move. You'll see right now, as I highlighted with the arrows, black currently is in a bit of a sticky situation here with the bishop pinned to the rook. However, black does have one move here to get out of this pin. So let's say I make a random move. Black actually has the really nice stunning move, bishop to b5. So bishop to b5, although it looks like it's losing a bishop, the reason why we're not losing the bishop is because we have rook takes a1. So if you take the bishop, you would lose the rook and most likely lose the game. And here, if you take the rook, then simply bishop takes. The bishop's no longer attacked by the pawn, and there is no more pin because the rooks are both off the board. And obviously, if you move the rook somewhere else, then the bishop just goes somewhere else, and then it's no longer pinned, and then black and white just continue playing the game. However, here, since we know now that our opponent's idea is to go bishop to b5 in order to protect the rook, because we can't take with the pawn, white found this really nice move, rook a2. So the idea with rook a2, as you see highlighted, is that this bishop is basically defending this rook. And basically now there is no bishop b5. Reason being, there is this move c takes b5. So c takes b5, although it looks like it loses it out on the rook, but this bishop now is actually open, and it's actually covering the rook on a2, which is why this sort of forces black into this pin situation, because black's only hope of getting out of the pin is now gone because bishop b5 is covered by simply c takes b5. So that's kind of the extent of the pin in this game. Afterwards, black tries to get a bit active, but basically soon after, not in this position, but soon after, black actually ended up losing because of this really wicked pin basically on the a file. Black was basically paralyzed for the rest of the game, and white went on to win this game. So just to reiterate, bishop b5 here doesn't work because c takes b5. This rook is protected by this bishop, which is why black has no way of getting out of the pin. If you go anywhere else with the bishop, then simply rook takes rook. So for example, bishop d7, rook takes rook. In this case, it's check, and you're down a rook, so you would end up losing the game. So that's the second example. Third example we have here, as this time it's the player with the black pieces. So this is just a couple of setup moves. So here with black, the player played, so these are just a couple of moves just to get back the piece. And then you'll notice right here, black already has this nice pin here, the knight to the king. And this is an absolute pin, as I mentioned before, because the piece is pinned to the king. So the piece can actually move even if it wanted to. So here, white defended with rook to d5, putting another defender on this knight so that it cannot be taken. But however here, the player with black still took the knight anyway. The reason being that, well, firstly, the king can't take because the bishop's defending. And then, so white has to take back with the rook. Otherwise, they'll lose it on a piece. And you'll notice that here, the bishop is still pinning the rook to the king. So at any point, black can choose to win back this rook. It doesn't have to be right now because obviously black can choose to make a random move and the rook is still pinned to the king. For example, a move like this, the rook is still pinned to the king. So black doesn't have to take it right now. But here, black continues with the idea of attacking the pin piece, as I mentioned in the first example, by playing the move rook to d8. So now you see, again, there's two pieces attacking the rook. There's the bishop as well as the rook, defended once by only the king. So white here plays rook to d1, rook h to d1, I just specified, to defend the rook again. You'll see there's the white rook and the white king defending the rook, while there's the black bishop and the black rook, which are attacking. And here, to exploit this pin fully, black plays this really nice move c4. So c4, it's kind of like the first situation, the first example where we played the move king to f2. C4, it doesn't look like it accomplishes much, but it actually, white actually ended up resigning here. The reason being is because if we don't play the move c4, obviously white wants to try to get out of this pin of the rook on d2. So white's idea to get out of the pin is, obviously white can't run their king away to get out of the pin, because then white would actually lose out on material. So for example, this obviously, this rook is no longer pinned because the king has gotten out of the way. But here simply after we trade everything off, you'll see that black has an extra bishop. So white basically can't run away from defending this rook because then there would be two pieces attacking where only one piece is defending. So instead, another option for white in order to stay defending this rook and get out of the pin is to make progress by going c4 and then c3. And then here, white can play the move king c2. So you see here now that compared to the king being on b2 or b1, the king being on c2, it still defends the rook. There's still two defenders and two attackers, but this time the king is also out of the pin. So this is why
well, obviously now black has to trade, because if you don't trade, then you have to realize that you're still down a bishop for a rook. So now after black trades everything, there's chances for both sides, but I would say white is actually probably better here with the more active king. So that's why the move c4 was played, because c4 exploits the fact that now these two pawns cannot move forwards because the c pawn is here, and white obviously can't jump over black's piece. So that's why this is quite beautiful, because these two pawns can't move, so the king has no way to play king to c2 at any point. You can move this rook to maybe get the king around, because then this rook will no longer be defending this rook, and you would lose it undefended. So basically, it's quite funny. But here, just to illustrate, you would have to pretty much just move your pawns, and then black can pretty much move their bishop back and forth. Still keep in mind there's this pin happening. So basically, none of white's pieces can move. If they move, then you would lose material. And then once you force white to have no more moves, then here white has to move their king, because that's pretty much the only move. If you move your rook, then you would still lose your rook anyway. And once white moves their king, then you realize that there's only one defender earlier in this position. And then once you trade, you realize that you're up a bishop, and this should be a win. So it's actually quite interesting that a simple pawn move has restricted white's complete position here, and is able to basically allow black to win the game. So the fourth example now. So this is actually an example of a game where the players in the game actually ended up missing the idea, but I don't blame them. It's quite a complicated idea, but I'll try my best to explain it. So here in this position, it's black to move, and black in the game played the move rook takes b1 check. And soon after, basically at the end, this game ended up being a draw. But however, here, black actually missed a chance to win the game. So how black could have won the game is with the very stunning move bishop to a6. So bishop to a6, it looks quite complicated, but I'll explain. So pretty much bishop to a6, firstly, you'll see that there is the pin idea here. The bishop on a6 is pinning the d3 bishop to the king. However, we do notice that this bishop can obviously take this bishop on a6. The thing is, once we take here, you realize that this rook is no longer protected. So we can play a move like rook takes b1. Checking the king, and we're up a rook for a bishop, so we should be able to win this game. Alternatively, the current threat in the position, I should mention, is that, let's say a random move is played. Since this bishop is pinned, this bishop is technically no longer protecting this rook, because after rook takes rook, if you take the rook with the bishop, you'll notice that the king is wide open. So that's the current threat in the position after bishop to a6, which is that this rook is completely undefended. Besides, you can also take this bishop if you choose to. That's also another threat in the position. So here, let's take a look at what happens also with rook takes rook. So rook takes rook, you see this rook is undefended. The threat here is that we can simply take this bishop first, check. And you'll notice that these two squares are cut off because of this bishop on b6. So white's only move, king to e1. And after king to e1, we can play this move bishop to a5. So bishop to a5 sets up another pin, this time pinning the rook to the king. And this rook can't move because it's an absolute pin. So we'll be able to take this rook at any point we choose to. And once we win the rook, you'll realize that we have an extra bishop. So we'll have an extra bishop. White does have a knight, but we also have another bishop, so we'll be up a piece. So just to demonstrate a variation that can arise after, king d2, attacking the bishop. The bishop goes to f1, getting out of the way. King to f3. Now the idea is to play something like king to b3 and then move the rook out of the way, because once the king's no longer pinned on this diagonal, then the rook would be able to move. And here we can take a pawn for free. And then here, basically, once the knight attacks the bishop, we have to take the rook at this point. If we don't, then, well, we're probably going to be losing this game, or maybe it's going to be a draw because we took both of these pawns, but that's a bit complicated. But you'll see that now we have two pawns, two extra pawns, and those should be able to promote to queens. So, and also one more variation here after bishop a6, since this rook is undefended, as I mentioned, and this bishop is technically undefended. If white plays a move like rook to d1 to defend this bishop, so now if bishop takes a d3, rook takes d3, then, well, this is probably going to be a draw. rook and bishop versus rook and knight and 2 pawns should be a draw, relatively speaking. But here, black actually has a stunning move, taking advantage of this pin, which is the move rook to b1. Rook to b1, actually, there's a lot of pins now happening everywhere, and a lot of black pieces which are hanging. There's obviously a pin here, bishop on a6 pinning the d3 bishop, and this rook on b8 pinning this rook on, this rook on b1 pinning this rook on d1. So let's look at the captures that are possible here. So firstly, I would mention that bishop takes b1 is not a possibility because this bishop's pinning this bishop here to the king. So that's the quick first capture that we can't do. Second capture we can look at is a move like rook takes b1. Rook takes b1, the problem with this is that we now can play bishop takes d3. This attacks the king and also attacks the rook. So once the king moves, we can simply take the rook. Take king e1, and then bishop takes b1, and we're up a piece. The other capture we can do here, bishop takes a6, obviously doesn't work because then white would lose out on a rook, and rook takes d1. This should be a win for us because we have a rook for a bishop, so that should be a win. So those are the different variations in for this specific tactic, and this also brings me to my next point, which is that in chess there's when we're calculating tactics, we have to make sure to calculate every single variation, because even if one variation fails, then our opponent could play into that variation, and then we would end up losing the game, or maybe the tactic doesn't work, and in some form or another, the position is still completely equal in some way. So which is why when we're looking at tactics, we have to calculate every single variation very precisely so that we can figure out if this tactic actually works. Thankfully, in this position, with all those variations, the tactic still works. Okay, and the final example I have, we'll actually skip ahead here. Oh, sorry about that. So we'll skip ahead to right here. So this is an example of a pin where the pin doesn't necessarily win the game, but it does help as a basically as a defensive resource. So basically the idea here is that we can also use tactics to get out of situations which are, we'll say, really dangerous, or situations where it looks like we're completely lost, but obviously tactics can obviously save us here. So just to illustrate, so we'll look at white. So white has just played the move queen takes c7, and black plays the move queen takes d3. So it looks like this gives away a queen, but however, after e takes d3, this is a little bit of review as well. There's checkmate in one for black. Can anyone tell me what it is?
If you move the pawns, then the rook will take your rook, and you just can using a wait.
Move the rook to e1.
Yep, that is indeed checkmate. Reason being that this pawn is protecting g2, rook covers the back rank, and this bishop covers f2, and obviously e2 is taken by the rook as well. So this would be indeed checkmate. So this is actually also an example of a pin. Reason being, if you take obviously, then the rook is threatened by 2 pieces and actually be checkmate. So this is also an example. This is still an example of a relative pin, by the way, even though it would be checkmate next move. So we can't obviously take this queen. Other variations that are other things that are quite annoying in white's position is that queen takes d3. You'll realize that well, this rook is actually attacked firstly. So if we aren't careful, then we can actually lose out on this rook here. So for example, and then another variation here is queen. So let's say queen takes c6. The other threat here is black can come back, queen to e3, and checkmate here is pretty much impossible to stop, because there's the bishop here teaming up with the queen on f2, and checkmate is pretty much impossible to stop. So that's another threat in this position, and that's also why we have to take the knight first, because you'll notice that currently the knight's defending f2. So here, with all these threats in mind, white manages to find a very nice move in order to save the game and render it pretty much equal. White plays this nice move, queen to d8. So queen to d8, it pins the rook to the king, the rook on e8 to the king. And you'll notice that this queen obviously firstly is attacked by two pieces, the bishop as well as the rook. But what's funny is here, there's actually no piece that can actually take it, where black actually gets a sizable advantage. So let's say rook takes d8, then here we can simply play e takes d3. White does lose out on a rook, but compared to the threats I mentioned earlier with checkmate, as well as losing out on a rook, losing out on a free rook, this is obviously better, considering that both sides still have a rook, and honestly speaking, both sides have chances to win this game. Next capture we'll look at is bishop takes d8. Bishop takes d8 doesn't work either for the same reason. Now e takes d3, and now this is actually even better for white because you'll notice that black has a bishop and a rook, whereas white actually has two rooks, which is why this is better for white. Let's look at queen takes c2. Queen takes c2 is another capture we can do, but here you'll notice that this rook is actually still hanging. So queen takes e8 is possible. And now you'll notice that, well, there's a queen and a rook on the board for white and a queen and a bishop on the board for black. So this should be winning for white as well. Another capture we can look at is bishop takes e1. That's the fourth capture in this position, which is bishop takes e1. This loses even harder. This is actually the worst variation to go into, because after queen takes on e8 with check, the king has to move, king h7. And then here after e takes d3, white has a rook and a queen, and black this time only has a bishop. So this is the harshest variation to go into. In the game, we had the rook capturing the queen. This is indeed the best variation to go for, because you'll see both sides only have a rook left, so there's chances for both sides. And even with all these looming threats in this previous position here, after the stunning move queen d8, white actually went on to win this game really nicely. We won't go into that because that's not really related to the extent of this class. So in general, that's sort of different examples of pins and how sort of tactics in chess. Firstly, we have to calculate them very precisely in order to make sure we don't lose out on any form of material in any way, because usually pins and tactics, they usually involve some form of sacrifice in some way or another in order to gain the piece back later on. Besides, we also have to, besides pins or tactics in general, can also be used as defensive resources. And thirdly, in general, tactics, they have a certain beauty to them, which is that moves that look completely unrelated to the situation of the tactic can actually have devastating threats towards the specific tactic. So those are 5 examples of the pin in real games. And now we'll just do 1 or 2 quick practices for the pin, and then we'll split into breakout rooms. Hopefully you guys understood so far what I've been explaining with these real games. Yep, so I'll share my screen. We'll go through 1 or 2 of these, and then afterwards we'll split into breakout rooms. So here, white to move.
Rook to e4.
Rook to e4. You mean rook to d4 or rook to, because e4 is this square. So
Oh, wait, no, wait.
Yep.
E1, sorry.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Yeah, so rook to e1 is indeed the correct move. So rook to e1 here, the idea is that this bishop is pinned to the king, absolute pin again, because this bishop can't move even if it wanted to. And there's no way to actually defend this bishop without losing even more material. For example, rook to d4 is covered by the knight, and rook to e6 is covered by the pawn. So there is no way to defend this rook. Sorry, not rook, no way to defend this bishop, and the king can't get out of the way where this bishop is protected. So black would simply be losing a piece. After king to f8, for example, you can simply take the bishop, and we are up a piece. We'll do 2 more, and then we'll split into breakout rooms. So black to move. I'll give a hint. This is actually we're looking for actually a checkmate here. And this is checkmate in 1.
Queen to E1, E8, E8.
Oh, sorry, this is black to move, not white to move. If it was white to move, queen to E8 is a good try, but there's actually rook takes C8, so it wouldn't be quite right, but it's a good try though.
Knight to D3.
Knight to D3 is also a good try. The issue is I understand that you're trying to exploit, I guess, the idea that this pawn is pinned because it can't take, otherwise the rook would take the king. However, there are other pieces here which are defending the D3 square, basically, which are the rook, bishop, as well as the queen. But you are on the right track with the move knight to D3.
Is it B3 then?
Yes, that is correct. Knight to B3 is actually checkmate. Reason being, B1 is covered by the A2 pawn. The square that the king is currently on, C1 is covered by the knight. D2 is also covered by the knight. And you can actually take, as we mentioned earlier, because of this pin here, if the pawn takes, then the rook will be able to take the king. So this is an example of a pin where a pin was able to help deliver checkmate. Okay, one more example. Black to move here. Actually, this one's a bit complicated. I think we'll skip this one. Yeah, this one is a bit complicated. It involves a couple of moves. I'll quickly show the solution, however, just to demonstrate. The idea is queen takes d4. We'll do another one after this. Queen takes d4 because sort of this rook can't take because it's pinned to the king. So after knight takes d4 to regain the queen, then we can take the rook here on d2. So that's sort of the idea with this one. We'll do one more. That one was a bit complicated. Okay, this is black to move. Yep, Henderson, yep, rook to g8 is correct. Idea with rook to g8 is to pin the queen to the king. Pretty much, this queen can't move off of the g file because if it does, then we take the king. And the best that white can do, as you saw, was queen takes g8 in order to get a rook back for the queen. This rook can't be taken, by the way, like I mentioned, because there's rook takes king. There's no way to move the king to protect the queen. And even if you do, then you'd still be losing out because it's a rook for queen. So yeah, basically anytime you can get a queen pin where the queen is basically lost, that's the best type of a pin because, well, the queen is the most powerful piece besides the king. So basically a queen pin is the strongest you can get. So those are the 3 examples we'll go through together. Now we'll split into breakout rooms to do a bit more practice. I'll assign you guys to breakout rooms.